January 1944. 30,000 feet above central Germany, the winter sky hangs in a pale, brittle silence broken only by the droning of battered B-17s pushing toward home. Frost crawls across their aluminum skin. Oxygen masks leak white vapors, and inside the turrets the gunners' gloved hands tremble from cold and exhaustion. Below, the ground is hidden beneath a quilt of cloud, but above that cloud comes the danger they fear most. Black specks rise in the distance, fast, predatory shapes climbing with intent, German fighters closing in on a formation already torn open by flak. Waist gunners scan the empty blue for help that too often never arrives, knowing that once the enemy reaches gun range, survival becomes a matter of seconds. Then, almost impossibly, new shapes appear high above the bombers, glinting silver against the frozen sun. Long-legged fighters drop their noses and fall into a protective dive, engines screaming through the thin air. For the first time in months, the bombers are not alone, and the moment marks a shift whose origins stretch far beyond this single flight into the deeper story of how the air war reached this turning point. By late 1943, the air war over Europe had become a brutal contest of endurance that the United States Army Air Forces were steadily losing. The promise of daylight precision bombing, built on the belief that well-armed heavy bombers could fight their way to the target and back without escort, had already collapsed under the weight of experience. Raids on industrial centers like Schweinfurt and Regensburg revealed the grim truth. Without a long-range fighter to stay with them deep into Germany, bomber crews were left exposed to a level of sustained attack few airmen had imagined. The Luftwaffe's defense network, honed by years of combat since 1939, stretched like a steel barrier across the continent, combining radar-guided interceptions, layered flak belts, and fighter wings positioned to strike at predictable choke points. The USAF kept sending its B-17s and B-24s into that firestorm, convinced that attrition would eventually wear down German resistance. Yet with each mission, the casualty lists grew longer. On Black Thursday, October 14, 1943, more than 60 bombers were lost over Schweinfurt alone, a staggering blow that shook the strategic bombing doctrine at its foundation. The aircraft that were meant to cripple German industry instead became symbols of sacrifice, limping home with shattered tails, burned-out engines, and crews too often missing or dead. Early escort fighters, including the P-38 Lightning and P-47 Thunderbolt, performed bravely but simply lacked the range to stay with the bomber stream past the western German border. They turned back near the Rhine, leaving the formations defenseless through the most dangerous portion of the mission. American commanders understood the numbers with cold clarity. At the current rate of loss, the strategic offensive might collapse before it achieved any decisive effect. Efforts to solve the problem had been underway since 1942, but the aircraft intended to provide long-range protection faced technical limits that could not be wished away. The P-39 and P-40, widely used in the early war years, suffered severe performance drops above 15,000 feet, making them unsuitable for high-altitude escort. The British Royal Air Force, no stranger to the pressures of air defense, experimented with new fighter designs and evaluated American models as they became available. One such aircraft was the North American P-51, originally developed at British request and designed around aerodynamic efficiency rather than brute engine power. Its early Allison engine variants showed great speed at low level but faltered in the thin air above 20,000 feet, relegating them to reconnaissance and low-altitude fighter-bomber work. At first glance, the Mustang did not appear to be the solution to the crisis unfolding over Germany. Yet behind this mismatch lay the seed of a transformation. Engineers, strategists, and frontline pilots all sensed the same looming danger. Unless a new escort capability emerged, the entire air campaign might be forced to halt. The 8th Air Force leadership grappled with this reality during anxious winter briefings, studying maps dotted with losses and considering how quickly German fighter strength could regenerate. Across the Channel, Luftwaffe commanders noted the heavy costs inflicted on the American bombers, confident that with enough pressure they could break the offensive entirely. Every factor pointed to a narrowing window, a point at which the balance of the skies might tip decisively in Germany's favor. Yet amid this deepening crisis, technical discussions and test flights hinted at an alternative future, one in which a redesigned Mustang, equipped with a radically different power plant, could climb high into the stratosphere, fly farther than any Allied fighter before it, and remain with the bomber stream from the English coast to the heart of Germany. The idea was still unproven, still little more than an engineering hypothesis, but suggested a way forward at the moment when commanders most needed it. That possibility, fragile as it seemed in late 1943, was all that prevented the strategic bombing offensive from grinding to a halt, and it opened the door to a change powerful enough to reshape the entire air war, setting the stage for the next chapter in this unfolding story. The breakthrough arrived when British engineers and test pilots pressed for an unconventional marriage between the Mustang's streamlined airframe and the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, an engine already proven in the Spitfire and renowned for its high-altitude performance. What emerged from this combination was an aircraft transformed, capable of climbing aggressively through the icy reaches above 25,000 feet and holding its power where the earlier Allison models faltered. Flight tests in late 1942 and early 1943 revealed a fighter that handled with uncommon grace, conserving energy in turns, accelerating cleanly in dives, and most importantly, carrying enough internal fuel to promise extraordinary range when fitted with external drop tanks. The British recognized the significance immediately, recommending mass adoption, while American officials, initially cautious, began examining the new P-51B and P-51C variants as a potential answer to the crisis over Germany. As evaluation flights continued, the 354th Fighter Group became the first U.S. unit to receive operational Mustangs, sending their pilots aloft over the wintry fields of England to explore the machine's true limits. Reports flowed back describing a fighter that could outrun and outclimb many German types, particularly the Bf-109G and the Fw-190A at higher altitudes where previous American fighters struggled. The Mustang's laminar flow wing, still a relatively new aerodynamic concept, provided remarkable efficiency at cruise speeds, stretching its range to distances once thought out of reach for a single-seat escort. The prospect of accompanying bomber streams to the deepest industrial zones, Leipzig, Augsburg, Berlin, no longer seemed an engineering fantasy, but a viable operational reality. At 8th Air Force Headquarters, planners examined fuel range charts, escort timetables, and interception forecasts, realizing that for the first time, they might be able to provide uninterrupted protection from takeoff to target and home again. Senior commanders, such as General Ira Eaker, were under intense pressure to justify continued daylight operations, while incoming leadership under General James Doolittle brought a more aggressive philosophy that aligned perfectly with what the Mustang could offer. Across the channel, German intelligence analysts noted the appearance of new, fast Allied fighters, but did not yet grasp the scale of the shift. Their defensive system still relied on the assumption that American escorts would turn back early, leaving bomber formations exposed during the critical stretch when Jagdgeschwader units could mount concentrated attacks. That assumption, so central to the Luftwaffe's defensive timing, was about to collapse. As P-51 squadrons gained experience, they ventured farther from the English coast, probing the edges of German airspace, escorting reconnaissance missions, and joining limited bomber operations to test their endurance under real combat conditions. Each mission affirmed the same truth. The Mustang could stay with the bombers longer than any previous fighter and still have the speed and agility to carry the fight directly to the intercepting German units. For bomber crews who had grown accustomed to watching their escorts peel away near the Rhine, leaving them alone with the rising waves of enemy fighters, the sight of Mustangs still holding formation deep inside Germany felt almost surreal. Their arrival represented more than a technological improvement. It hinted at a fundamental rebalancing of the air war, one that could finally relieve the crushing attrition that threatened to shut down the strategic bombing campaign entirely. Even so, the Mustang's full impact remained a matter of potential rather than certainty, dependent on leadership decisions, tactical innovation, and the ability of pilots to master the aircraft's unique characteristics and harsh realities of combat. The stage was set for a transformation, but to understand how profoundly the P-51 reshaped the conflict, the story must be viewed through several crucial angles that reveal the human, tactical, technological, and strategic dimensions behind its rise to dominance. The Mustang's emergence cannot be understood without first examining the human dimension, because for the men who fought the air war, the threat was not abstract strategy, but the relentless grind of missions measured in hours of fear and seconds of violence. Bomber crews lived with the knowledge that once they crossed into Germany, survival depended on thin aluminum skins, machine gun turrets, and the distant hope that their escorts would return before the attacks began. They memorized the sound of incoming cannon fire, felt the shudder of engines hit by flak, and watched formation mates fall in spiraling trails of smoke. Fighter pilots carried a different burden, the responsibility to dive into swirling dogfights at altitudes where a moment's hesitation could condemn entire bomber crews. Mustang pilots trained not just to fly the aircraft, but to think several miles ahead, anticipating enemy vectors, preserving their own oxygen supply, and managing the long hours of cold exposure on missions that pushed them to physical limits. In these men's hands, the P-51 became more than a machine. It was a lifeline, a promise that the next formation they escorted might avoid the fate of those who had flown before them. The emotional weight of this task shaped the culture of the fighter groups, creating a fierce determination to stay with the bombers no matter the weather, fatigue, or opposition waiting ahead. Yet to grasp the Mustang's true influence, the tactical dimension must follow the human one, because range and performance alone did not win the air war, new strategies did. Earlier escorts had been forced to operate in rigid, fuel-driven sequences, turning back at predictable points that German commanders exploited. The arrival of the P-51 allowed mission planners to redraw escort maps entirely, assigning Mustangs to penetration support, target area coverage, and withdrawal protection in layered blocks that denied German fighters the unguarded windows they depended on. Instead of hugging the bomber formations tightly, Mustang squadrons increasingly roamed outward, intercepting enemy fighters before they could form attack groups. This fighter sweep approach, encouraged by new leadership, shifted the air battle from reactive defense to aggressive disruption, forcing the Luftwaffe to fight when and where the Americans dictated. The Mustang's speed gave pilots the confidence to engage briefly and break away cleanly, while its climb rate allowed them to regain altitude and strike again. These tactics eroded the Luftwaffe's numerical advantage, disrupting their carefully timed intercept chains and stretching their resources thin across multiple altitude bands. Bomber crews noticed the change immediately. Fewer head-on attacks, fewer disciplined fighter waves, and more instances of German units being scattered before they reached firing range. The Mustang's tactical flexibility reshaped the entire rhythm of daylight missions, replacing the desperate, defensive posture of 1943 with a coordinated offensive strategy capable of taking the fight directly to the enemy. Interwoven with these tactical innovations was the technological angle, the set of engineering advances that allowed the Mustang to operate where no Allied fighter had operated before. The Merlin engine, breathing smoothly in the frigid stratosphere, delivered power that earlier Allison engine Mustangs could not maintain above 20,000 feet. The aircraft's laminar flow wing reduced drag to levels unprecedented for a piston fighter, allowing exceptionally efficient cruising speeds and conserving fuel on the long flights from East Anglia to the heart of Germany. Its internal arrangement prioritized aerodynamic cleanliness, from the radiator's clever Meredith effect, which generated thrust, to the streamlined fuselage that maintained stability even under combat loads. Engineers equipped the Mustang with 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, giving pilots the firepower needed to tear through armored Luftwaffe fighters without sacrificing speed. But perhaps the most decisive technological asset was not on board the aircraft at all. It was the ability to carry drop tanks, extending operational range far beyond what earlier fighters could manage. These tanks allowed pilots to stay with bomber formation for the entire mission cycle, turning the Mustang from a point defense fighter into a continent-spanning escort platform. Combined, these innovations produced a machine that fit perfectly into the tactical and human demands of the air war, enabling pilots to endure long patrols, engage determined adversaries, and still return home with enough fuel to cross the North Sea. Through this blend of human resilience, tactical evolution, and engineering sophistication, the Mustang began to exert a force that would soon reshape the balance of the skies, setting the stage for deeper angles still crucial to understanding its full impact. To see the Mustang's effect from the enemy's perspective is to understand how deeply it disrupted a system the Luftwaffe had spent years refining. German fighter units were already stretched thin by campaigns in Russia, the Mediterranean, and the defense of the Reich, but until late 1943, they still held a decisive advantage in home territory. Their radar network detected approaching formations. Their pilots, many hardened by years of combat, launched in coordinated waves that hammered American bombers during the long, unescorted stretch into central Germany. But with the arrival of the P-51, this delicate architecture began to fracture. Mustang squadrons dove into assembly areas before German fighters could group, scattering formations and forcing hurried, disorganized climbs. Losses mounted not just in combat, but through exhaustion and fuel depletion as German pilots struggled to keep pace with an enemy that appeared over Berlin in 1 hour and reappeared over Hanover the next. Training schools, already strained by fuel shortages and accelerated curricula, could not replace the veteran pilots falling in growing numbers. Engineers worked frantically to upgrade the Bf-109 and Fw-190, but the technological gap widened faster than they could close it. As Mustangs pushed deeper into German airspace, even airfields themselves came under threat, with fighters attacking the very bases that once launched the Luftwaffe's most disciplined formations. For Germany, the arrival of the P-51 was not merely a new opponent. It was the collapse of a defensive model that had previously forced the Americans to pay dearly for every mile flown. Just as critical as this enemy pressure was the leadership angle, because strategy determined how the Mustang would be used, and leadership decisions in early 1944 shaped its legacy. Under General Ira Eaker, the 8th Air Force emphasized staying with the bombers, adhering closely to established escort doctrine. But when General James Doolittle assumed command, he implemented a radical shift. Fighters would no longer be bound to the bomber boxes. Instead, they were free to seek out and destroy enemy aircraft wherever they found them. This policy liberated Mustang pilots to apply the aircraft's full performance, turning escorts into active hunters rather than passive protectors. Doolittle understood that simply safeguarding the bomber stream was not enough. The Luftwaffe had to be broken as a fighting force. His approach encouraged offensive sweeps ahead of bomber formations, the clearing of air corridors, and the systematic targeting of German fighters during vulnerable takeoff and landing phases. These decisions amplified the Mustang's strengths, allowing it to dictate the terms of engagement instead of merely reacting to them. The shift in leadership philosophy marked a turning point in the air war, showing how operational vision could elevate a capable aircraft into a war-defining weapon. The final angle lies at the intersection of strategy and morality, a dimension often overshadowed by the technical and tactical details of the air war. The strategic bombing campaign was built on the belief that crippling German industry would shorten the conflict and reduce overall casualties, yet the human cost, both in bomber crew losses and civilian destruction, was profound. Cities targeted for their factories also endured firestorms, displacement, and thousands of civilian deaths. Many Allied leaders privately questioned whether such devastation could be justified, even as they recognized that stopping the Nazi war machine required extraordinary pressure. The Mustang played a complex role in this moral landscape. On one hand, its presence dramatically reduced bomber losses, saving thousands of American lives. On the other, its escort effectiveness enabled deeper, more destructive raids that struck at the heart of Germany's industrial capacity. In this sense, the P-51 was both a shield and a sword, protecting the men who flew into the Reich while amplifying the power of the bombing campaign that reshaped the continent. Its long range allowed commanders to expand target lists, hitting oil facilities, transportation networks, and aircraft factories previously unreachable without catastrophic losses. These operations hastened Germany's collapse, but they also contributed to the vast human suffering inherent in total war. Understanding this moral angle does not diminish the Mustang's strategic value. It clarifies the weight of the choices facing wartime leaders, the dilemmas that defined Allied air strategy, and the broader consequences of turning an engineering triumph into an instrument of national will. Through these combined angles, enemy collapse, leadership transformation, and moral complexity, the P-51's story deepens, preparing the ground for the moment when all these forces converged into the turning point that reshaped the skies over Europe. By the winter of 1943-44, the tension in the air war had reached a breaking point, and it was during this volatile season that the Mustang proved it was more than a promising design. It was a weapon capable of reshaping the entire conflict. The first deep escort missions into Germany began cautiously, with P-51 squadrons joining bomber formations over the cloud-covered fields of Western Europe and staying with them far beyond the old withdrawal points. As January turned to February, the missions grew bolder. Mustangs followed the bombers over the Rhine, past the flak concentrations around Cologne and Frankfurt, and into regions where American crews had previously endured the worst attacks without a single friendly fighter in sight. The Germans reacted with intensity, launching interceptors in waves from bases scattered across central Germany. But the rhythm of these attacks no longer matched the precise, devastating cadence they once commanded. The Mustang's speed allowed pilots to surge ahead of the bomber stream, slashing into enemy assembly zones where Bf-109s and Fw-190s climbed in tight formations toward the contrails above. Momentum shifted with startling speed. German pilots who once prepared deliberate, coordinated attacks suddenly found themselves under assault before reaching altitude, and squadron leaders struggled to reorganize scattered groups under constant pressure. Mission logs from the 354th, 357th, and 4th Fighter Groups recorded engagements at altitudes where American fighters had barely operated months earlier, describing dogfights that unfolded in thin, freezing air as Mustang engines roared at full power. Bomber crews, watching from miles below, saw silver shapes weaving through German formations, driving attacks away before they could form into deadly head-on charges. These scenes repeated across mission after mission, increasing in intensity as the 8th Air Force pushed deeper into industrial Germany. The psychological effect was immediate. Bomber crews reported a surge of confidence, noting that they no longer braced for the moment their escorts turned home. Some missions still suffered losses, the flak belts remained deadly, and the Luftwaffe was far from defeated. But the sense of helpless isolation that had defined 1943 began to dissipate. Meanwhile, for German commanders, the appearance of Mustangs over targets like Oschersleben, Halberstadt, and Brunswick signaled the unraveling of a strategic advantage they had held since the start of the air campaign. Reports filtering up the chain of command described formations broken apart before their attacks could begin, escorts pursuing German fighters to the edges of their fuel limits, and the increasing difficulty of replacing experienced pilots lost in these encounters. The most dramatic shift came during the early Mustang runs toward Berlin, a destination that had long symbolized the limits of American air power. In March 1944, when P-51s escorted the first bomber formations to the German capital, they shattered the assumption that no Allied fighter could reach the heart of the Reich. Luftwaffe units scrambled desperately to defend the symbolic target, but they met an opponent that could climb with them, fight with them, and follow them home. The sight of Mustangs over Berlin carried a weight far beyond the tactical. It announced to friend and enemy alike that the era of unchallenged German airspace had ended and that a new phase of the air war had begun, one in which the Luftwaffe found itself increasingly on the defensive, reactive rather than dominant. These early deep escort missions formed the sharp edge of a campaign that was about to reach its most violent and decisive moment. A moment in which strategy, technology, and attrition collided during a week that would define the course of the air war. The decisive moment arrived in February 1944 during the campaign that would be remembered simply as Big Week, a concentrated series of assaults designed to cripple the German aircraft industry and force the Luftwaffe into a battle it could not afford to avoid. From 20 to February 25th, day after day, massive bomber formations lifted from English airfields and pointed their noses toward the industrial centers of the Reich, striking factories in Gotha, Regensburg, Augsburg, Schweinfurt, and Braunschweig. What made these raids different from the catastrophic missions of 1943 was the constant, unbroken presence of P-51 Mustangs sweeping ahead of the bombers, flying alongside them through the most dangerous corridors, and hunting German fighters long before they could mass into effective strike groups. Mission planners had structured the week with ruthless precision. Each attack targeted facilities essential to Germany's fighter production, forcing the Luftwaffe to defend every strike regardless of cost. The Mustangs embraced the new strategy fully. Freed under Doolittle's doctrine to seek out the enemy at will, Mustang squadrons tore across German airspace on offensive sweeps, diving on airfields crowded with fighters preparing to take off and catching returning aircraft low on fuel. The effect was devastating. German pilots scrambled into the sky only to find themselves ambushed at vulnerable moments, fighting opponents who held the altitude advantage they once considered their own. Mid-air engagements intensified as the week progressed, with contrails twisting into violent spirals over central Germany and gun camera footage capturing the collapse of formations that had once anchored the Reich's air defenses. Even when bombers took losses, and they did, the scale of those losses no longer mirrored the catastrophic attrition of the fall. More importantly, the Luftwaffe's own casualties soared into territory it could not sustain. Factories bombed during the first days of the offensive struggled to maintain output, while the loss of veteran instructors and experienced leaders eroded the combat effectiveness of the remaining units. Reports from Luftwaffe Gruppenkommandeur acknowledged the increasing presence of American fighters far beyond the range once considered possible, describing Mustang attacks on climbing formations as constant, sudden, and exhausting. On the ground, repair crews raced to patch runways cratered by fighter-bomber attacks, only to watch Mustangs return hours later to strike again. By the end of Big Week, the German aircraft industry had been severely disrupted, but the deeper consequence was the depletion of the Luftwaffe's irreplaceable pilot corps. The Air Force that had dominated Europe in 1940 and had bloodied the American bomber fleet in 1943 now faced a crisis from which it would never fully recover. The skies over Germany were no longer shaped by carefully orchestrated defenses, but by desperate, fragmentary engagements that bled strength from the Luftwaffe with every encounter. The Mustang had not won the air war in a single stroke. Yet Big Week represented the moment when the balance tilted decisively, when the Luftwaffe lost the ability to contest the Allied advance on equal terms. In the aftermath of these February missions, American commanders recognized that daylight bombing could now continue without the specter of unsustainable losses, and that the path to air superiority, essential for the coming invasion of Western Europe, had finally opened. The relentless pressure of the Mustang had broken the rhythm of German resistance, and as the smoke of Big Week settled, the trajectory of the war shifted toward an Allied dominance that would reshape the months leading to D-Day and beyond. When the roar of Big Week faded, the true scale of the transformation in the air war became impossible to ignore. The Luftwaffe, once a formidable and disciplined force capable of tearing apart unescorted bomber formations, emerged from February 1944 battered in ways that no amount of determination or improvisation could repair. Losses among experienced fighter pilots had reached a level from which recovery was unlikely, and training schools, strained by fuel shortages and accelerated schedules, could no longer replenish the ranks with aviators capable of matching the skill of those who had fallen. At the same time, the German aircraft industry, already stretched by Allied pressure on oil, aluminum, and transportation networks, struggled to rebuild factories damaged during the concentrated raids. Assembly lines slowed, spare parts became scarce, and maintenance units found themselves forced to cannibalize grounded aircraft simply to keep a fraction of their fighters operational. Against this unraveling defense, the P-51 continued to extend its reach. Mustangs swept deep into Germany during missions that would have been unthinkable only months earlier, accompanying bomber formations in numbers that ensured no segment of the flight would go unprotected. Bomber losses, once measured in dozens per raid, dropped sharply as the Mustangs pressed outward to intercept German fighters long before they could form into coordinated attack groups. For American crews, the psychological shift was profound. The dread that had defined missions over Schweinfurt, Bremen, and Regensburg gave way to a cautious confidence as pilots and gunners realized that the shadows appearing through the high-altitude haze were no longer enemy fighters, but the sleek silhouettes of their own escorts returning from sweep. Sustained daylight operations, once under threat of collapse, now resumed with a sense of purpose that matched the growing strategic needs of the war. As spring approached, the 8th Air Force intensified its pressure on Germany's remaining industrial centers, striking oil refineries, transportation hubs, and aircraft assembly plants with a frequency the Luftwaffe lacked the strength to counter. The shift in momentum was not merely statistical, but structural. The German fighter force no longer dictated the terms of battle. Instead, it reacted to an enemy that could appear anywhere, at nearly any altitude, with the endurance to stay long after German fuel gauges ran low. The Mustang's presence did not eliminate danger. Flak continued to exact a harsh toll, and isolated pockets of skilled German pilots still posed serious threats, but the fundamental character of the air war had changed. The Allies had seized the initiative, and with it, the possibility of establishing the uncontested air superiority needed for the next phase of the conflict. The skies that had once forced American crews into desperate defensive formations now opened into a battle space shaped increasingly by Allied strategy, and this shift carried implications that extended far beyond the immediate mission totals, setting the stage for even deeper consequences in the months that followed. The months following Big Week unfolded. The consequences of the Mustang's dominance rippled through every aspect of the European air war, shaping not only the fate of the Luftwaffe, but the trajectory of the entire Allied campaign. With German fighter strength weakened to the point of strategic fragility, the Allies intensified their strikes on oil refineries and synthetic fuel plants, knowing that the Luftwaffe's lifeblood flowed from those targets. Mustang escorts made these deep raids possible, allowing bombers to reach installations at Luna, Politz, and the Romanian fields feeding the Reich's fuel network. As gasoline stocks dwindled, German pilot training hours plummeted, and even frontline squadrons struggled to keep aircraft aloft for more than a fraction of the time needed to preserve combat readiness. The burden on Germany's shattered logistics system grew heavier, and the erosion of the nation's industrial and military capabilities continued in a downward spiral. When Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Normandy, the strategic impact of the Mustang became unmistakable. The Luftwaffe, once feared for its precision and ferocity, could not mount a coordinated defense against the massive aerial shield the Allies deployed over France. P-51s roamed far beyond the beaches, sweeping the skies clean in advance of the operation and choking off any attempt at a meaningful German counterattack. The air superiority achieved in early 1944 did not merely support the ground assault on D-Day. It shaped the entire operational environment, ensuring that German units moving toward the front did so under constant threat from the air. Throughout the summer and fall, Mustangs escorted bombers striking deeper into Germany, hunted rail lines feeding the Western Front, and intercepted the limited fighter resistance that still rose to challenge them. Even as jet aircraft like the Me-262 appeared, their small numbers and fuel-starved airfields prevented them from altering the momentum already carried by months of Allied dominance. By the time the ground war pressed into the heart of the Reich, the Luftwaffe had been reduced to fragments, scattered groups of undertrained pilots flying machines they could barely maintain. The Mustang's contribution extended beyond the war itself, influencing post-war doctrine and serving in new theaters, including Korea, where its range and versatility once again proved invaluable. But its deeper legacy lived in the memories of those it saved. The bomber crews who returned home instead of vanishing into the frozen skies of 1943, the fighter pilots who found in the Mustang a trusted partner, and the commanders who recognized that air superiority, once achieved, reshaped the entire nature of modern warfare. The P-51 had not only changed the outcome of the European air campaign, it had demonstrated how technology, strategy, and human resolve could converge into a single instrument capable of altering history's course, paving the way toward the final reflections that define its enduring place in the story of World War I. In the final accounting of the war in Europe, the P-51 Mustang stands not merely as a machine of aluminum, fuel, and engineering genius, but as a symbol of what can happen when necessity, innovation, and human resolve intersect at a decisive moment in history. Its long, elegant wings carried more than firepower. They carried the hopes of bomber crews who had watched too many empty seats fill their debriefing rooms, and the determination of fighter pilots who understood that each mission was a chance to save lives rather than count losses. The Mustang did not end the war by itself, nor did it erase the terrible costs of strategic bombing. Yet changed the shape and meaning of the conflict in ways that no single aircraft before it had accomplished. It restored the balance in a sky that had long favored the defender, shifting the burden from survival to strategy, from endurance to initiative. In doing so, it forced the Luftwaffe into a struggle it could no longer sustain, opening the air above Europe for the operations that followed, from Normandy landings to the relentless advance toward Germany's industrial heart. But beyond its tactical and strategic achievements lay a quieter legacy, the recognition that thousands of airmen returned home because a machine finally existed that could accompany them all the way into danger and all the way back again. Historians often speak of turning points in broad strokes, measuring them in shifts of policy or territory. But sometimes a turning point arrives in the whine of a supercharged Merlin engine, the shadow of a fighter sliding into formation beside a wounded bomber, or the silent relief of a crew who realizes they will live another day. In that sense, the P-51 Mustang did more than win the air war. It restored the fragile thread of human survival to a battlefield that had nearly consumed it. Its legacy endures not in the statistics of missions flown or aircraft destroyed, but in the way it reshaped the very idea of air power, proving that the right innovation at the right moment can alter the fate of nations and the lives of countless individuals who might otherwise have been lost to history.